Hi everyone, it's Bina 007 here, and this is Vassals of Kings Grave's 57th episode of the Agatha Christie reread. Today it's a minipod, which means I'm on my own and I'm discussing Third Girl, which was originally published in 1966 at the height of swinging London, which Agatha Christie, in her 76th year, is trying to capture. This novel comes after At Bertram's Hotel, published in 1965, and before the iconic Endless Night, which we will for sure have a full podcast for, published in 1967. As always, this will be spoiler-free until the end credits music, at which point we will discuss the spoilers and solutions. So, to give you the introduction, Third Girl features Hercule Poirot and Ariadne Oliver, kind of equally balanced, which is unusual, and I think it's all the better for it. It's also unusual because it is a puzzle mystery, but you're a little bit pondering whether a murder has actually taken place. And I guess the central mystery is whether the lady who presents herself to Hercule Poirot saying, I think I might have committed a murder, whether she actually has or whether she's just mentally unsound, and also who indeed has been murdered. As Hercule Poirot says more than once, someone get me a body. I need a body to investigate. There's lots of really lovely Christie-verse stuff in here. We have Stinningfleet, a doctor, who came in a short story called The Dream, first published in The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding in 1960. And we have Mr. Goby, the private investigator, who I think is a really lovely Dickensian character, who first appeared in After the Funeral in 1953. We also have Poirot referring to his old friend Colonel Race, as well as Inspector Giroux from Murder on the Links. That's a really deep cut because that was a very, very early Agatha Christie from the 20s, where she's almost kind of satirizing that sort of Sherlock Holmesian, I must follow the physical clues type of a detective, and that person is embodied in Inspector Giroux. There's also, as one might expect, enormous amounts of social change in this novel because it is the 1960s and you're seeing it through the eyes of Agatha Christie. Now, there seem to be two major criticisms of this book from people who class it as third tier Christie or lower Christie. One is that the plot, while absolutely, I think, gripping while you're reading it, at the end, when you stop to think about it, has a lot of holes. And I think that is a valid criticism, and that's why this is a mini pod and why I'm doing it on my own. But the second criticism is that she cannot capture the milieu of the swinging 60s London because she's not part of it. And I think that's actually unfair. I think she does get it really right. I felt like I was really experiencing some of the drug-addled hippie culture and the loosened sexual mores. And I really enjoyed seeing it through Poirot and Ariadne Oliver's eyes, which is why, for me, I think this is mid-tier Christie. And I have to say, when I was reading it, and I haven't done that for, a few decades, I really did enjoy it. It was too long, and I think for some of the Christies at her height, they are so concise. I mean, something like Parallel and House, I think, is barely 230 pages in paperback. This kind of gets towards 300 pages, and I think could have been 250 in her height. She would have, cut off some of the fat from the bone. But I really enjoyed it nonetheless, and I hope you enjoy this discussion too. So let's get into some of the social change, and there is a lot. Number one, a weakening of class stratification, according to George the butler, Poirot's manservant. She is good looking, this young lady? Poirot inquired carefully. In my view, no, sir, but there is no accounting for tastes. Poirot considered his reply. He remembered the slight pause that George had made before the phrase young lady. George was a delicate social recorder. He had been uncertain of the visitor's status, but had given her the benefit of the doubt. You are of the opinion that she is a young lady rather than, let us say, a young person? I think so, sir, though it is not always easy to tell nowadays. George spoke with genuine regret. And there's going to be a lot of conversation in this novel about how young girls nowadays all look like they need a proper bath. They have long, lanky, greasy hair that hangs over their face, ridiculous white pan makeup, and they're beatniks, right? And we get a little bit of this in Pale Horse too, so this isn't the first time. I think it's absolutely spot on. Here we have Agatha Christie on beatniks, and this is Hercule Poirot's perspective once again. His visitor was a girl of perhaps 20-odd. Long, straggly hair of indeterminate colour strayed over her shoulders. Her eyes, which were large, bore a vacant expression and were of a greenish blue. She wore what were presumably the chosen clothes of her generation: black high leather boots, a skimpy skirt, and a long and sloppy pullover of heavy wool. Any one of Poirot's age and generation would have had only one desire: to drop the girl into a bath as soon as possible. He had often felt the same reaction walking along the streets. There were hundreds of girls looking exactly the same. They all looked dirty. And yet, a contradiction in terms. This one had the look of having been recently drowned and pulled out of a river. Such girls, he reflected, were not perhaps really dirty. They merely took enormous care and pains to look so. And you can just imagine Agatha Christie thinking the same. And when people think, how did she get into this? One has to remember that her grandson, her only grandson, Matthew Pritchard, would have been around 20 when she was writing this novel, and perhaps she'd met some of his girlfriends and university friends. So I think that's pretty accurate. And maybe for the first time, really since Peril at End House, this novel is suffused with drugs, and not just the cocaine that we had there, but cocaine, heroin, LSD, all the new crazy drugs that are out there. Here's a description. She could have gone to one of those purple pill parties and had a fight with someone. She could have come to and found she had stabbed someone. So here you go. I mean, and actually, when she talks of Agatha Christie talks of purple dreams and other various names, these were actually drugs of the time. And I think it's really funny that, Agatha Christie established her reputation because she'd worked in a pharmacy as someone who really knew pharmacopoeia and had very accurate descriptions of drugs and poisoning, and that interest maybe and skill is still relevant in her mid-70s. And then, of course, we have the way young girls live nowadays, which is reflected in the title of the book, A Third Girl, Someone to Have a Flat Share. And remember, our first novel in 1920, young girls would not have been living on their own in flat shares with strangers in London. And even then, a number of characters when our protagonist goes missing. Kind of like, is this even something to worry about? Don't girls just go and do what they want to do these days? Like, no one even really remarks on it as something to be concerned about, which I think speaks to the really unprecedented freedom that young women were given in this era. So here's a description of flat shares. She went to a side table and snatched up the Times, turned the pages over and brought it to him. Here you are, look. Third girl for comfortable second floor flat. Own room, central heating, Earl's Court. Third girl wanted to share flat. 5 guineas a week, own room. Fourth girl wanted Regent's Park, own room. It's the way girls like living now. Better than PG's or a hostel. The main girl takes a furnished flat and then shares out the rent. Second girl is usually a friend. Then they find a third girl by advertising if they don't know one. And as you see, very often they manage to squeeze in a fourth girl. First girl takes the best room, second girl pays rather less, and third girl still less, and is stuck in a cat hole. They fix it among themselves. So this is Ariadne Oliver explaining to Papa Poirot how flat shares work, which is hilarious. We also have some other social change. So as in The Mirror Cracked, we have the appearance of supermarkets. Quote, what had lately been the local grocer's had now blossomed into calling itself a supermarket, complete with stacks of wire baskets and packaged materials of every cereal and cleaning material, all in dazzling paper boxes. Brilliant. And then we have council houses. So what we refer to as council houses in England are houses built by the government and leased on very favourable terms to people of lower incomes. At the end of the village, there came an abrupt transition. On one side, we see back from the road was a row of newly built council houses, a strip of green in front of them, and a gay note set by each house having been given a different coloured front door. So this is very much like The Mirror Cracked. So lots of social change, particularly around the freedom that young women have, the drug taking. I think it was all very successful. But others disagree. I hope if you read this book, you find it as compelling as I did. So what would have been in the minds of people receiving this novel as they received it? Well, in January of 1966, Indira Gandhi was elected as the first female Prime Minister of India. In March of 1966, the British government announces plans for the decimalisation of the pound sterling in 1971. Remember before I just referred to paying for something with guineas? Well, guineas and shillings and sixpences is all going to get abolished in 1971, and a far more rational system of measurement is going to come into place. In March of 1966, we also have French President Charles de Gaulle taking French troops out of NATO. How times have changed. Also in March of 1966, the United Kingdom gets a new socialist government led by Harold Wilson, winning with a resounding 96-seat majority. In April 1966, the opening of Parliament is televised for the first time. And we have the Moors murders, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, going on trial at Chester Crown Court, a case that is infamous in British legal history and was still relevant in my youth and upbringing as people debated whether Myra Hindley should be released. In June 1966, how often have you seen a US cop program and someone having their rights read to them, the Miranda rights? Well, this is when the Supreme Court decision is taken. In Miranda versus Arizona, the SCOTUS rules that police must inform suspects of their rights before questioning them. We also have the Vatican, as part of Vatican II, abolishing the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or the Index of Banned Books. In July of 1966, England infamously, famously, notoriously, nostalgically beats West Germany 4-2 to win the 1966 World Cup at Wembley after extra time, something that we have never achieved since. In August 1966, the Beatles hold a press conference in Chicago, and John Lennon apologizes for saying that they were more popular than Jesus. In October of 1966, and very relevant for this novel, LSD is made illegal in the United States and controlled so strictly that not only are possession and recreational use criminalized, but all legal scientific research programs on the drug are shut down as well. That feels kind of slightly hysterical. Also in October 1966, the civil rights struggle moves on. Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton found the Black Panther Party in the United States. For fans of The Crown, this is when we have the Aberfan disaster in South Wales. Really sad tragedy where a number of people, including over 100 children, were killed by a collapsing coal spoil tip. And finally, in November 1966, the month of publication of this book, Ronald Reagan is elected governor of California, and Truman Capote's legendary black and white ball is held in New York City. Okay, so those are the times in which this novel was published and in which people would have been receiving this book for Christmas. So let's start with our investigators among the characters. First and foremost, we have Hercule Poirot, our renowned Belgian detective. And we pick up on a theme from the clocks where Poirot is bored. He is reading detective novels to fill his time. This is a quotation. He had finished his magnum opus, an analysis of great writers of detective fiction. He had dared to speak scathingly of Edgar Allan Poe. He had complained of the lack of method or order in the romantic outpourings of Wilkie Collins, had lauded to the skies two American authors who were practically unknown, and had in various other ways given honour where honour was due and sternly withheld it when he considered it was not. So there we are. I wonder if those are the views of Agatha Christie. He's also old. And this is the problem, right? Because when the young distressed girl comes to see him saying she might have committed a murder, which sets the events of the novel in place, she actually can't go through with it. This is what she says. I'm awfully sorry, and I really don't want to be rude, but... She breathed an enormous sigh, looked at Poirot, looked away, and suddenly blurted out, "You're too old. Nobody told me you were so old. I really don't want to be rude, but there it is. You're too old. I'm really very sorry." And of course, this is the Xander Lord Blackfire memorial bit. Poirot still loves himself and thinks he's the best. Quite right too. Quote, "No one, so far as I know, naturally she had heard about me, no doubt." Mrs. Oliver thought that naturally was not the word at all. What was natural was that Poirot himself was sure that everyone had always heard of him. Actually, large numbers of people would only look at you blankly if the name Hercule Poirot was mentioned, especially the younger generation. But how am I going to put that to him, thought Mrs. Oliver, in such a way that it won't hurt his feelings? So his partner in detection is Ariadne Oliver, our famous author and often a thinly veiled version of Agatha Christie. I wonder how far this hits home. Quote, "And then people say things to me, how much they like my books and how they've been longing to meet me, and it all makes me feel hot and bothered and rather silly, but I manage to cope more or less. And they say how much they love my awful detective Sven Yersin. If they knew how I hated him. But my publisher always says I'm not to say so." End quote. And crucially for this novel, Ariadne Oliver is always changing her hairstyle, and at the moment she's wearing a very elaborate coiffure with lots of hair extensions that she sort of pins in with bobby pins, and they keep falling out and she has to pick them up, or other people, how mortifying, pick them up for her. We do have a detective, Chief Inspector Neil, who we have seen in a prior book. and he's there, but sort of less used than he was in that book, but still a good character. Mr. Goby, the detective. But let's get into the people who really are at the heart of the story. So the heart of the story, the impetus for the story, is a young girl of about 19 or 20 called Norma Restorick. And she's the one with the shabby, lanky hair. She's meant to be not very pretty, which is rather harshly commented upon. And she's very vague. And we come to learn that she's very drugged up, actually, which is partly why she's very vague. She thinks she's murdered someone, but she's not sure. She's having blackouts, and poor Poirot has to figure out, has she murdered anyone? And who has she therefore murdered? And also, she goes missing as soon as the book opens. So it's also a kind of a missing person hunt. She grew up in a lovely country house with her mother, but she resented her mother a lot because her father, Andrew Restorick, had abandoned her mother for Africa, basically to go on a big adventure and make money, and also to be with his lover called Louise. And Norma just grows up basically resenting the mother, thinking, well, he didn't leave me, he left you. And apparently, this is exactly what happened to Agatha Christie herself, which is just heartbreaking. Apparently, when Agatha Christie's first husband had an affair and left her, Agatha Christie's daughter would say this to her, like, well, he didn't leave me, he left you, I hate you. So this feels very believable and very tragic. So, in that period of time, her whole childhood, Norma hasn't really had contact with her father. When her mum dies, she's sort of farmed out to relatives and then goes to a boarding school. And people just all seem to think she's not quite there. They're very condescending towards her. And they just think she's a bit lost and a bit infantile and a bit not altogether there, which is really horrible. And I'm sure very misogynistic and happens to a lot of women. And she is the third girl of the title. So she's currently living in London in a flat share. And the people who also live in that flat are Claudia Reese Holland, who also turns out to be the secretary to Norma's dad, Andrew Restorick, who's come back from Africa, and another flatmate called Frances Carey, who works at an art gallery in London and travels a lot with art shows, putting on exhibitions. So those are the people that she lives with in this sort of, I think you can think of it a bit like the Arconia in Only Murders in the Building. It's a large enough sort of establishment of professionally let out flats that it has its own restaurant and porters and stuff. So it's pretty big, I think. So Norma sort of is part of the sort of Beatnik Chelsea set. She's got a boyfriend called David Baker, who's an artist, and Ariadne Oliver calls him the Peacock because he has that kind of, I think if you think of Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, and his look with the kind of, crushed velvet suits and frilly cuffed collars and long hair, shoulder length hair, and very much a sort of preening, fawning sort of guy. That is David. And it's questionable whether he's after Norma for her money, because clearly, why would he be with her? Because everyone thinks she's, simple and plain. But let's get a bit further into Norma's family. So she was brought up at her, I guess, uncle or granduncle's house. He's called Sir Roderick Horsfield. He's in his late 60s. Apparently, he was a big deal in World War II intelligence, but now his eyesight's fading and he's writing memoirs. And he has got lots of papers lying around the house, and he's hired a young girl called Sonia to be his personal assistant. And obviously, this old guy has gone absolutely crazy about this young girl, thinks she's the best thing since sliced bread. And the young girl is only too happy to take that flattery, I think, but is also, I think, quite sort of efficient. In that house, you've got the old boy, Sir Roderick, and Sir Roderick was uncle to the two boys, Andrew Restorick and his deceased brother Charles. So they run or have inherited a very prosperous city firm that does trading and merchant enterprises, I guess. Andrew, apparently, when he went off with this fancy woman, Louise, to Africa, just made a whole bunch of money, but eventually decided maybe it was age. It didn't work out with Louise. She came back to London. She missed London. So years later, he comes back to London, but he also marries a very young woman called Mary Restorick. And we don't really know much about her. She's dressed very prim and proper. She has quite an elaborate blonde sort of hairdo, and she seems to be kind of okay with the idea of maybe having Norma in the house, but it's just all very awkward. Norma clearly very much resents the new wife, and the psychology of it, as Poirot seems to think, is that having pined for her father to come home all those decades, And when he finally does come home, she thinks she's going to have him all to himself, but now he's got a wife in tow. So what's that about? And Andrew Restorick, I think, is quite an interesting character because he's clearly very successful in business, but he doesn't like it. Like he looks very sort of uncomfortable in the city and longs to go back to Africa. So those are the characters. The plot machinations are as follow. Norma comes, she says to Poirot, I may have committed a murder, but I don't want you to help me solve this because you're too old. He then unveils himself into the family home in the countryside and has a bit of a snoop around, as does Ariadne Oliver. The girl then goes missing. Hercule Poirot then sort of unveils himself with the dad, Andrew Restorick, and Andrew Restorick actually then ends up hiring Poirot to find the girl. Meanwhile, there are eventually two murders which Poirot can detect, and all is revealed. And I shall reveal in the after show. Okay, so let's get into stuff that's progressive or regressive. Not very much, actually, as is common in these later novels, right? So we've got rid of a lot of that anti-Semitism and racism and misogyny from the earlier books. So Roderick is racist, but I think we're meant to just see that he's an old stick in the mud. This is him on the French. Ah, well, I don't think he knew I didn't remember him. Clever chap, I should say, but a thorough frog, isn't he? Prancing and dancing and bowing and scraping. That's Sir Roderick on Poirot, by the way. But I think we're meant to just think of that as Sir Roderick being an old bigot, basically, and to judge him harshly for it. It's kind of interesting to me in the 1920s, Agatha always used to have these bronzed, handsome colonial officers as her heroes. And this is basically the hero of The Man in the Brown Suit become very old and become Sir Roderick. And now she just thinks they're really boring and prejudiced and just dull. And there's some sort of slightly dodgy stuff on effeminate men. This is Poirot in defence. Horrible creature, said Mary Restorick with a sharpness of rancour that startled Poirot. I can't bear him. I simply can't stand him. Why is England absolutely full of these people nowadays? She's talking, of course, of David, the boyfriend, the peacock who dresses in a very effeminate way. And this is Poirot's response. Ah, madame, do not disquiet yourself. It is all a question of fashion. There have always been fashions. You see less in the country, but in London you meet plenty of them. Dreadful, said Mary. Absolutely dreadful. Effeminate. Exotic. And yet not unlike a Van Dyck portrait, do you not think so, madame? In a gold frame, wearing a lace collar, you would not then say he was effeminate or exotic. So good for Poirot. Poirot's always had an eye for the aesthetic and for beauty, and I think that shows through here. In both men and women, I think Poirot is very acutely aware of whether people are good looking or not. Okay, so let's get into the reviews of this book. Maurice Richardson in The Observer in November 66 concluded, there is the usual surprise solution centering around a perhaps rather artificial problem. I'm skipping some words so as not to reveal it. But the suspense holds up all the way. Dialogue and characters are lively as flies. After this, I shan't be a bit surprised to see Agatha Christie wearing a miniskirt. I kind of agree. I think there is a good solution. It is astonishing. It does kind of make sense until it doesn't. And I think the mise-en-scène of 1960s swinging London is really well done. And yet Robert Barnard's contemporary review is much harsher. One of Christie's more embarrassing attempts to haul herself abreast of the swinging 60s. So I think that is more the mainstream opinion, sadly. I'm more with Maurice Richardson, but there we are. Okay, so let's get into some adaptations. There is only one. It's part of the ITV Agatha Christie Poirot series. And I think this one really suffers because that whole series is set in the 1930s. And this one, the milieu of the 1960s, the fashion of the 1960s, the look, the dress is so important. The drug taking to this book and its solution that I think to put it in the 1930s robs it of any joy that it has. And also just means that you have to completely change the solution and the plot to kind of get some plot out of it. So it's a really dull, lifeless adaptation. It doesn't bear, well, it bears some resemblance to the book, but a lot has been changed. And I would say that it's definitely one not to bother seeking out. It feels very much like they made it because at some point they'd made so many, they decided to do them all. And not for the joy of the thing and not for the love of the thing. So sadly, this could do with a proper 1960s set standalone adaptation for sure. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there in the spoiler-free part of this podcast. Join us next time for Endless Night, which really is a wonderful classic, one of the best of Christie's later works. And join us at the end credits music and listen after the end credits music for the solution and the clues. Okay, folks, we will now be giving away the ending to this novel, so if you haven't read it, please stop listening. Okay, here are some clues that I wrote down as I was reading this. There's a high church wife, Andrew Restorick's first wife, who doesn't believe in divorce. That can be a significant clue in Christie novels, but it actually turns out to be a red herring here. There are also some missing papers and apparent espionage involving Sonia, but that, while true, turns out to be a red herring as well. There's a Jaguar car that's going at great speed and apparently might have run Norma over in Chelsea, or was it just an accident? That also turns out to be a red herring because the people who are behind these murders need Norma to be alive so that she can take the fall. So the solution is that Norma is not mentally insane, just drug-addled and gaslit, a bit like the character Molly in A Caribbean Mystery, and that she has not committed murders at all. So here are the real clues to look out for. Number one, the young Mrs. Mary Restorick, the second wife, wears an elaborate wig. And also, she has a background in acting. Always a klaxon in Agatha Christie. Second, Frances Carey, who is the second girl in the flat, travels a lot for work and has dark, lanky hair that always covers half her face and very elaborate pan makeup. And as it will turn out, Mary Restorick and Frances Carey are one and the same person. Second big set of clues, Andrew Restorick, when he was married to the first wife, had a very famous portrait painter paint a pair of portraits of each of them. And he's now taken the one of him and put it into his city office. So it's a portrait of him much younger, very imposing. And this just strikes Hercule Poirot as odd. Why would you split up the pair? And it turns out that's because Andrew Restorick is not really Andrew Restorick. He is Andrew Restorick's friend who travelled in Africa with him, and when Andrew Restorick died, decided to come back and claim his fortune by passing himself off as Andrew. So he got the portrait repainted to look like himself and put it in the city office. And because he's been away for a couple of decades, no one's still employed there who would have known the real Andrew Restorick. And the portrait kind of serves as a sort of vouchsafe. The other thing we discover from Andrew Restorick's city office is that he's paying off David. And we think maybe he's just paying off David because lots of dads pay off feckless young men to keep away from their daughters. But Hercule Poirot comments on the fact that it's a very, very large check indeed, like more than you would think normal. And this is because David, who is a portrait painter, is the one who was employed to do the fake portrait. And he's now blackmailing the fake Andrew Restorick and Mary Restorick. And they are at the moment paying him, but they now have a motive to kill David. And he will therefore be the second victim of their murdering. The first victim is actually the real Andrew Restorick's mistress, Louise, who it just so turns out lives in the same block of flats as the three girls. Totally unnecessary, silly bit of writing there. But she had apparently fallen out of the window at the block of flats. People think it's suicide. She'd gone a little bit to seed. She was drinking heavily. This is the murder, the original murder that poor Norma Restorick thinks she's committed. And the reason why she has to be murdered is that this lover who went with the real Andrew Restorick to Africa would clearly be able to identify the fact that the quote-unquote Andrew who's returned is a fake. So she has to be killed because she could blow up the scheme. David has to be killed because he's blackmailing the murderers. And Norma is going to be framed for the murders as being someone who's jealous about her husband, jealous of the new wife, committed murders because she's mentally unstable. The only other thing to sort of explain is that Stillingfleet, the doctor that it turns out that Poirot knows, had basically admitted Norma into a nursing home, much as had happened in Peril at N House when Poirot wants to keep someone who could potentially be a victim safe from harm. And in part of a ludicrous Papa Poirot wrap-up, Poirot's going to basically have them marry off each other. So that's how it works. Here are some issues I have with it. Would Norma really not recognise Mary Restorick as her flatmate? I mean, living with someone up close? Is a change of hair and some makeup really going to do that? As I said before, it's a bit of a coinky-dink that Louise lives in the same block of flats as the girls. Effectively, I think it's kind of a little bit the same plot as The Man in the Brown Suit, but reversed, i.e., the traveling friend who adopts the dead friend in Africa's identity, in this case, is evil, not good. And it's also a bit similar to plot lines in A Pocket Full of Rye and Hercule Poirot's Christmas. So when someone's been to Africa for a few decades and comes back, just be sure it's really the right person. As I said, hiding a girl in a nursing home comes from Parallel in a House. There's a gaslit woman in Caribbean Mystery. The marrying off at the end really reminded me of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Tender as the Night, where Nicole, who's had a very traumatic childhood, is married off by her father to Dick Diver, who's a famous psychiatrist, basically to kind of keep an eye on her. It's all very weird. So yes, lots of echoes to Christie and other works in the ending. Anyway, like I said, I've got a fondness for Third Girl. It's a bit too baggy. There are plot holes, but I do like the swinging 60s, and I love that Agatha's immersing herself in that world. Anyways, thank you for listening. And if you have any comments or want to join the discussion, join Vassals of Kingsgrave on the Discord channel. If you go to vokpodcast.wordpress.com or find us on YouTube, you'll see a link to join. Thank you for listening.